Good evening, everyone. We're going to give everyone just a moment to join us this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. So we'll be getting started in just a minute. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, thank you, everyone. Good evening and welcome to tonight's virtual author discussion. I would like to thank all of you for taking time out of our spring break week to join us this evening as we discuss Every Valley, the Desperate Lives and Troubled Times that made Handel's Messiah with author Charles King. Before we begin, I just have a few short announcements to set the evening. We have one more virtual author discussion planned on our upcoming schedule. For history lovers, we invite you to join us on Wednesday, April 2nd at 7 p.m. to hear about the life of the trailblazing doctor and public health activist Alice Hamilton. Author and Johns Hopkins University professor Daniel Stone will join us on Zoom to discuss his newly released biography, American Poison, which looks at Hamilton's amazing career and how she tackled the public health crisis related to leaded gasoline. More information about this program, as well as all of our other events, can be found at hudsonlibrary.org. And we would love to hear from you tonight. I'm sure we have a lot of classical music fans in the crowd, maybe lots of fans of the Messiah. So please feel free, if you have any questions tonight, leave them in the Q&A located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. Also, copies of Every Valley are available for purchase, courtesy of the Learned Owl, and I've put a link in the chat for easy purchase. So I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Charles King is the author of 8 books, including the recently released Gods of the Upper Air, which was a New York Times bestseller, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and winner of the Francis Parkman Prize. And I was just telling him before we joined, I have an anthropology background. Absolutely love that book. It's great if you haven't read it. His Odessa won a National Jewish Book Award as well. He is a professor of international affairs and government at Georgetown University. So, Charles King, thank you so much for your time this evening to come and talk with us about this book.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to join you, and great to see everyone, at least virtually.
Yeah. Now, I know you talk about it in your intro for your book, but I
Yeah.
think it's kind of nice to set the tone because this is such a detailed book. You went so much into the research of this. I can tell you put a lot of work into this book. So
Yeah.
I would like to hear about what really drove you to research this, because as you shared with me, you're not like a music expert in the
Yeah.
background. You're more about history and culture and people. So what drove you to really start researching more about Handel and his Messiah?
Yeah, I mean, I teach political science and international affairs classes, and I'm really a historian, and I'm motivated by the stories of people and big ideas and big hinge moments in history. But the root to this book was really, I think, a little more personal, in the sense that my wife and I, in the middle of COVID, we're at home on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where we live. And, it was pretty low time for us and for everyone. We had a couple of very serious illnesses in our family, and we live 6 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, and we're, at home on January 6th. And I was looking around for kind of a way of feeling better in the middle of what had been, I think, for many people, the worst years they can remember. And some years earlier, for Valentine's Day, for my wife Maggie, I purchased a Victrola, one of those wind up record players from the 1920s, and she's a musician, loves music of that period. And so it was a fun gift. And I thought, well, if somehow I could find the oldest recording of Handel's Messiah, which we both loved, and would listen to at the Christmas season, like most people. If I would somehow find that old recording and put on the this Victrola and play it, that would somehow be some kind of really big magic, and it would help us feel better. And so I did what you would do, what anybody would do, which is go to eBay, and I found this old 1927 recording with Sir Thomas Beecham and the BBC orchestra and choir singing in Westminster Hall in London. And I put it on. And both of us, Maggie and I, we just burst into tears when the first notes sort of came out of this thing. And so I decided what I wanted to do was to follow that feeling in a way and to try to figure out why this piece of art, this piece of participatory art, because it's a thing that, amateur choirs sing or people sing along from their seats at amateur sing-alongs, all the way up to sort of professional choirs and orchestras doing it every year. This one of the most performed, beloved pieces of music ever created. What was its backstory?
Right.
And, you know,
Because
yeah,
I would assume that there has
yeah.
to be like a really interesting backstory to something like this that has transcended so much time,
Yeah,
right?
and that's right. And so there are plenty of biographies of Handel and really terrific biographies of Handel, but I never quite bought the lone genius sort of idea. And because this piece of music is so beloved, right? People desperately want there to be an angel on Handel's shoulder, sort of inspiring this thing. And as a historian, I'm kind of skeptical of stories like that. And so what I really wanted to do was to kind of chart the many people it took to create this thing, not just to tell the story of inspiration and genius, but of course Handel was a musical genius, but to tell the story of how lives intersected in the creation of this thing. And that's part of what I think is at base the story of this piece of music, that it took a whole set of lives, many at the lowest point imaginable, to create this kind of monument to hope. And that's why the book is called Every Valley, because it's about these dark and desperate moments of life that in this particular case came together in very profound ways to create a work of art that is now timeless.
Right, because before we go into like all of the details of like your book and like the history of the time, just to set the scene, we're talking about 1700s England.
Mhm.
And that was a very different time.
Yeah.
And so the average person living in England at that time, what types of things were they seeing? Like what was their life looking like? So for those of us who don't have that expert history background,
Yeah.
what were those dark times?
Yeah, so this is, it's really first half of the 18th century, sort of latter part of the 17th century into the first half of the 18th century. So to give people some bookends, Handel was born in 1685 in what would become Germany. Messiah premiered in Dublin in 1742. It doesn't really become popular until the 1750s, and then Handel died in 1759. So those are the bookends chronologically. It was a time of war. Britain is emerging as this great imperial power. The British Navy is emerging as commander of the seas, but in a whole series of wars on the continent and then globally, from India to the Ohio Valley, Britain is at war principally with France throughout most of this period. It's very rare that there's a season or a year without some kind of fighting somewhere. It's a time of disease. It's a time of worry, of great infant mortality. The infant mortality rate in London in the first half of the 18th century is 75%. So no one ever quite believes that number, but that's the actual number. So people would frequently, give the same name to multiple children on the assumption that one would die, and then the alternative you waiting in the wings would just be there to sort of pick things up. And so, for the earliest audiences who are listening to Handel's music, they had experienced the suffering and the trials and the tribulations that so much of Messiah ends up being about.
Right. So it was obviously a very dark time. And so with a lot going on, which is very counter, it's different from then the feeling that people feel when they experience the work of Messiah, right? Which is
Yeah.
definitely much more of an uplifting hope.
Well, it's kind of everything, right? Because you go through this whole series of dark valleys, right? Particularly in the second part, and where where a singer will tell of being despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, the whole passion story that you get
Mhm.
in Messiah. But it's about how you come through those experiences and ultimately have a sense of hope in the middle of it. And this also tracks, I think, with the philosophy and the theology of the time, right? We use the term Enlightenment to describe this era, even though that term hadn't quite been invented yet. To name the era when Handel is doing what he's up to. But it's a moment where people are trying to figure out what rational basis for hope is there, right? When everything around you, all the evidence suggests that there's no reason to hope, how could you still live a hopeful life in the face of it?
Right. Absolutely. So before we delve too much into all the history of the book, I'd like to talk a little bit about the research for you of
Yeah,
this part because
yeah,
as you mentioned a little bit in the beginning, your idea really started during COVID and we didn't have a lot of travel opportunities and things like that then. What was your research process like for this book?
yeah.
Did you end up actually traveling anywhere into England or anything like that to look at some of these museums and collections of these works? Because I know there are some very large museums that collect like Handel's works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I this ended up being a very good COVID project, although I wouldn't have predicted that from the very beginning because it turns out that the 18th century is one of the most digitized centuries, probably the most digitized century next to our own. And the reason for that is because, a lot of big and important things from the American Revolution, or the French Revolution, the entire Enlightenment, and so on are 18th century products. And so when librarians and archivists started doing massive digitization projects, well, the place they naturally started was with this century in which a lot of really big things happened and historians were interested in. So I spent about a year just using online resources when I really couldn't travel anywhere. We also live very close to the Library of Congress, which is kind of my local library. It's where I like to work, and using their collections was really essential. But then once we could travel, my wife and I went everywhere from Venice, which has a connection to the story, up and down the length of the United Kingdom, over to Ireland. I wanted to, of course, go to the place where Messiah was first performed in April 1742 and go to the actual site, which I did, and visit other sites in Dublin. And then, to use the incredible resources of libraries and archives in London in particular, the Foundling Museum, which is the successor to the old Foundling Hospital that I talk about in the book, which has one of the great Handel collections anywhere. And then I think the real highlight was being able to be in the same room, just me and a curator, with the original manuscript of Messiah, which is in the British Library. It's not on public display. They very kindly brought it out of the vault for me and would turn the pages for me. They don't want anybody handling it. But the actual original manuscript that Handel created between August and September of 1741, it was one of the highlights of my life.
That is amazing. I would love to see something like that.
Yeah.
Because I know that that has to be a really amazing experience. Was there like anything that was like really moving for you? I mean, probably seeing that original manuscript was really moving for you, but was there
Yeah.
anything that really made you like, oh, wow, I cannot believe this, like in your research process?
Yeah, I mean, that happened all the time, and that's why I love working in archives because you'll get a box out of the archive and you don't know what's in the box, and there'll be something really interesting or earth-shattering or new, often in there, and you never know when that's going to happen. But in addition to the original manuscript, I got to see the original performing manuscript, which is in Oxford at the Bodleian Library, and that's literally the manuscript that sat on Handel's organ at the very first performance in April of 1742. And it's much neater because a copyist has copied Handel's very, very messy original manuscript and filled out the parts. Handel composed very, very quickly. He wrote Messiah in 24 days. He wrote most things very, very quickly since he was composing for the stage. And he would do it very messily and kind of write the equivalent of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera on the manuscript, knowing that a copyist would come back and know what he meant and then would turn it into a proper score. to be played from, or parts to be created from, or to be conducted from. But it was really moving to me, I think, to see that one as well, knowing not only was it the music as Handel intended it, but it had been the one from which he was conducting at the premiere of this work.
Really? Wow, that's fantastic. I know that it's actually really impressive when you think about it though, like because the Messiah is so long. It's a long piece. I mean,
Yeah,
I know some people have participated in extended versions of it. A lot of times it's abbreviated for live performances just because it is almost like 3 hours in length. Some people only know highlights like Hallelujah.
yeah,
Depends on what you are into for the performance.
yeah.
But to take that amount of music and to create that in just such a short amount of time, I can only imagine what his hand notes actually looked like of how many
Yeah.
changes he had to have made.
Yeah, they're very messy, and he would have a different idea and sort of cross out things. At some point, we don't know whether it was during the composition or after, someone spilled an entire ink pot on one page, so there's a massive ink stain on one of the manuscript pages, which I reproduce in the book. So it's fun to think about what was happening in the swirl of his household, which was a normal household, with himself, with servants, with assistants, with copyists running around. It was also a place of business. It was also his studio. So it was a very kind of messy, chaotic environment most of the time. But he would, yeah, you could see when he has a musical idea and he wants to complete the idea, he'll go into the margin of the page and sort of extend the staff lines by hand, into the margin of the page, and then jot down what he was trying to do before that, musical idea would kind of scurry away from him. But you raise a good point. Just final point on this. Um, Handel was primarily a public composer, and that's how we have to think of him. So he's much closer to a John Williams, scoring for movies, or an Andrew Lloyd Webber sort of composing for the stage, than he is to what we might think of as a classical composer only performed in concert halls in white tie. That is not what Handel was in his lifetime. So he was always on deadline, he was always composing quickly, and he was always trying to have an effect on an audience, right? Because he was composing, say, an opera where he wanted you to feel something at a particular moment. And he brought all of those skills to bear on Messiah.
I think that's a great point to bring up about how he was a little bit different than some of the other composers of the time that may have had such legacy that we think of often and how they are different from one another.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, and it is very true in your book, you talk about a number of different characters that really kind of have a point in this. But there's one big character whose name is always on the side. And I know he's listed on the Wikipedia article, but how
Yeah.
many people really look into him?
Yeah, yeah.
And that is the man Charles Jennens.
Yeah, Charles
And
Johnson.
without Charles Jennens, we would not have a Messiah because Charles Jennens is the one who creates the basis for this.
Correct.
For those in the audience today who really don't have any knowledge and they're thinking, who's Charles Jennens? Who's Charles Jennens?
Yeah, no one should know who Charles Jennens is, but we should all make an effort to find out, because Jennens was the essential partner to Handel in the creation of Messiah. The idea of an oratorio, which is essentially a kind of scaled down opera, which was a form that Handel was already experimenting with at the time. It was Jennings' idea to create a thing called Messiah. He assembled the biblical texts, put them in the order that he wanted them to go in, and then shipped that off to Handel, unbeknownst to Handel. At some point, Handel got this either by post or was delivered to him somehow, and then he sat down to transform that into the musical piece that we know. And he may have sat on it for a year or more than a year until he had an occasion to actually compose music to go with the text. But Jennings is an incredibly interesting figure. He was one of the wealthiest men in Britain at the time, but he suffered from a thing that in the 18th century was called the HIP, HYP. It was short for hypochondria, but it didn't mean what we mean by that term now. Hypochondria was essentially, it was thought to be the male equivalent of hysteria in women, according to the medical philosophy of the time. And it would manifest itself as this encasing sense of doom, a deep, deep, long-term depression. We might call it chronic depression now, or even bipolar disorder, maybe. And Jennings, at some point, decided to try to write himself out of this condition. He collected art, he collected music, he was kind of a Handel super fan. And he turned to the place that meant a lot to him, the holy texts. He was a devout Christian, high church Anglican. And he sat down to try to reason through what basis for hope could he find in these texts. And that's why, there's nothing in the biblical order in Messiah. There are bits from the Hebrew prophets, and then something from Revelation, and then something from elsewhere in the New Testament from the Gospels, and then something from the Psalms, sort of all around, right? Because we're hearing the order that Charles Jennings wanted us to hear it in. So we're going on his kind of philosophical and theological journey through these sacred texts toward that mighty kind of amen and glory at the very end of the performance.
And obviously, with Handel working on a deadline to write the composed musical portion of it, though, do we have any research or backing of how long Jennings spent putting together and analyzing which biblical portions he did and in what order? Like how long this took for him?
Yeah, we don't because we don't have the original text. You can dream that someday some terrific doctoral student somewhere will be working in an archive and pull out Jennings' original manuscript, but it's quite likely that that's been lost. He composed it at some point composed what we call the libretto, or the text for this at some point between 1739 and 1741. But we don't know if he spent weeks on it, months on it, years on it. Um, and he finally told a friend of his that he had just completed, and this is in, I think, 1740, that he had just completed a thing that he hoped Handel would lay his entire musical skill and genius upon, so that it would be, as Jennings put it, unlike any of his other compositions. And he was right in the sense that, of course, he had no idea that it would go, you and I would be talking about it now, right, in a place called the United States, which of course didn't exist at the time. But he was right about it being unlike anything Handel did, because Handel didn't create really anything else like this. It kind of stands alone in all of Handel's work, even though he's borrowing bits and pieces from his other compositions to fill it out. It really stands alone as this composition, and that's why I think we ought to think of this as being Jennings and Handel's Messiah, really, because they kind of were the Bernie Taupin and Elton John of the 18th century. You have to have the lyricist or librettist and the composer to create this thing.
And did these two gentlemen have any type of a relationship, friendship, or anything like that prior to Jennings just shipping off his libretto to Handel? Was
Yeah,
there
they
like
had
anything
worked,
beforehand?
right. They had worked on a couple of things before with modest success, worked on oratorios before with rather modest success, and Handel collaborated with a lot of librettists over the course of his career. The distinction here is that it looks like this was a thing that just meant a lot personally to Jennings. And from what we can tell, he and Handel didn't discuss it, didn't plan it ahead of time. This is just a thing that he set, as we would say, set the religious text himself and then sent it off to Handel.
Which is interesting because this was such a deeply personal thing for Jennings, it seems like. And philosophically and politically, these two individuals were very different from one another.
That's a very good point. They were absolutely different. They were, in fact, on opposite sides of what was really the greatest political divide of their time. And the big question that divided them was, who is the legitimate king of Great Britain? So for Handel, he was in service of the royal line at the time. He was court composer to George I and George II, the first two sovereigns in the so-called Hanoverian line of kings that had succeeded the older Stuart line. Whereas Jennings believed that the Hanoverians were essentially illegitimate, that when the Stuarts had been ousted in the 1680s And for those of you who are sort of British history buffs, you'll know the Glorious Revolution of 1688 ousted the Stuart line. There was one more Stuart sovereign um, right before the Hanoverians came back to power, Queen Anne. But essentially, the Stuart line was at an end. But the Stuarts were always plotting how to come back to power. So a group of people called the Jacobites in the very late 17th century and early 18th century were a kind of underground conspiracy in Italy, in France, maybe underground in Britain itself. There's certainly a lot of worry about the Jacobite conspiracy. Within the United Kingdom at the time. And then they would lead an uprising in 1745 and 46, primarily in Scotland, the so-called Jacobite Rising, the 45, that would end in failure. But at the time, it was, it was almost like a 9/11 attack. It would shook the entire political establishment and shook the confidence, I think, of British society at the time. So Jennens was a kind of Jacobite sympathizer, and Handel was in service of the reigning British king. So, they were total political opposites, but somehow came together as friends, and they were friends. Jennens was a kind of patron of Handel's as well. But they came together to create this remarkable work of art.
Which is kind of a power. I mean, there's lots of examples and things we can pull from in culture and the arts of music and stuff like that being a source of unity, that it can bring
Yeah.
people together even if they are on opposite sides of something.
Yeah,
And
and we live in a very politically divided time ourselves, but we are not more divided than 18th century Britain was divided. We are not more like that than they were at the time.
mhm. Now, curious, obviously Jennings was, he had depression, there was lots going on with him. He writes this and he gives it off to Handel. Handel creates something. Um, what was Jennings' reaction to the actual creation and his initial feelings towards Messiah?
Yeah.
Was he really fond of it, or did he have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, so he probably didn't hear it until 1743. So it premiered in Dublin, which is kind of unusual. It's kind of premiered in what London society would have thought of as the provinces then. But then it came to London in 1743 for a couple of performances. Jennings probably heard it then, and we know on the basis of letters that he wrote to friends and relatives at the time that he was very, very disappointed to begin with for a couple of reasons. One, he just thought that Handel had done a cheap job on various bits of it. He could recognize um, melodic lines, for example, that Handel had taken from some of his previous compositions and essentially recycled, which is a very common practice among composers at the time. And for Handel, if you've got a great melodic line or you've got a great chord progression and it does exactly what you want it to do, why wouldn't you use that over and over and over again, right? It's why 95% of rock music is essentially the same set
That's
of
what I was
chords.
exactly thinking,
You
was all
know,
the songs written in
exactly.
the same chords.
Yeah, if it works, right? If it works, sort of use it.
Hmm.
But Jennings was very, very upset by this. It was also the case that the so-called word book, which is the printed text that you could follow along with, you'd purchase it at a performance. The word book for the first performance, 1742, was just full of printer's errors, and he thought, you can't treat biblical texts like this in this cheap kind of way. And so he worked on a new word book for the 1743 performance. And you were asking about, fun things I got to see in the archives. There is one copy of the 1743 word book left in the world, and it's at the Morgan Library in New York. That is the one that is probably as close as we can come to the text as Jennings imagined it, because we think he corrected the word book for the first London performance.
Oh, that sounds so exciting. I always love random facts.
Yeah, yeah.
So, another thing I want to talk about, because people will mention this. So, I have told you, my classical knowledge is just very kind of small, really mostly focused on classical when I was like playing clarinet in middle school and high school band.
Yeah,
That was
wonderful.
about it. It's not my number one genre of music. I hate to say it. Sorry, everyone tonight. But you know, I want to talk about because I did listen to Messiah in its completion, all 3 hours. I actually listened to two different versions of it.
Wonderful.
And the thing is, there are very different sounding versions of this. There are
Yeah,
some pieces that are very mellow that I had it on my car, I like turned all the way up and I could barely hear it. And then there
yeah,
were some where it was just like blasting through the speakers.
right,
Can you
right.
talk about how the progression of like the arrangement and the performance and how this has like grown into such a participatory act? It seems like it's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
much grown over time.
Yeah, it has. And I mean, sometimes people ask me what my favorite recording is or what my favorite version of Messiah is. And my response is always, well, it's whatever one you're listening to, right? Whichever one you have on the stereo or your phone, or if you're in an audience experiencing it. Um, because Handel's living in a time when the idea of an authentic version of music would have been very strange. So he would raise and lower parts, he would change the keys of parts, he would drop entire sections out, he would change the orchestration. And he was a working musician, and you go to war with the army you have, right? Even for the Dublin performance, he was kind of pulling musicians and singers from wherever he could find them. Um,
Mm.
because you got a show to put on and the show must go on. So I think there are versions that try to get back to what the instrumentation would have sounded like on period instruments in the 18th century, so-called historically informed performance. And that's just terrific, right? It takes you back to the sonic world where the tuning is a little bit different, and so it can sound sort of weird to a modern ear. And then there are these gigantic, Mormon Tabernacle Choir orchestral performances, and they have a different kind of power. And Handel would have loved it all, I think, because he was accustomed to the idea of there not being one singular, encased in plastic version of this music. But it was really over the course of the second half of the 18th century, in the 1750s, and then continuing after Handel's death, and then the great centenary performances to mark the 100th anniversary of Handel's birth in the 1780s, that all of his music began to be performed kind of at scale. So in the 1784 performances for his birthday in Westminster Abbey, Handel, of course, long gone by this stage, but under George III, you have this massive orchestra, massive combined choirs singing Handel's music. And that's where we kind of began this tradition of singing these kinds of things at scale. Over the last 40-ish years or so, you now have a lot more performances that are quieter, smaller, probably closer to what the folks in 1742 would have experienced. But I think they're all terrific, and they have a different kind of effect on you, depending on the setting and the orchestration and so on.
I can definitely agree to that because I know I had different feelings when I listened to the different versions. I'll be
Yeah,
honest. I thought the more mellow, subdued was kind of a little bit more just relaxing. But
yeah,
I felt like when they were listening to like the big loud version, it definitely had more like feeling. It was a little bit more energizing. This is just
yeah,
from me perspective.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
definitely know that there is differences in the power and what you can communicate based on
Sure.
like how large of a scale you're performing. So I
Yeah,
thought that's really cool. And I'm sure that like as you're saying the trend, it could for all we know in 10, 20 years, we can go back to being wanting it to be loud and proud again. Um, you know, I don't want to uncover everything in your book because the reality is we're talking more than just Charles Jensen in this book. There's actually a lot of very interesting characters in the world of theater, performance, and stuff like that that you've uncovered. And I'm sure that these like were uncovered throughout your research as like different names and stuff are coming up in the archival records and stuff
yeah.
like that. Did you have like a favorite minor character in here that you really connected with and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to share this story?
Well, I think, the book is really about the life and times, the lives and
Mhm.
times that made this piece of music. So it goes into the philosophy of the era, the economics of the era, in a way, the psychology of of the time, art and architecture, politics of the moment. But I guess one of the minor, so there are five major characters whose lives sort of wrap around the creation of this work of art. But among the minor characters, I think Jonathan Swift was probably one of my favorites because people know Jonathan Swift because of Gulliver's Travels, of course. But he was also, by the time Messiah premiered, he was dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. He was very much at the end of his career, end of his life. Gulliver's Travels is sort of 40-ish years in the past. He is at the early stages of dementia, and he and Handel meet, and they have probably one of his last conversations was with Handel before he departed Dublin. And I won't give it away, but Jonathan Swift does play a really important role in the first performance, the premiere of Messiah.
I can vouch for that. He really does. So I think that was actually something really cool. I know there was the one character that ends up having the weird like adultery lawsuit even
Yeah,
that you
yeah.
talk about. There's a lot of different interesting people that again from like the anthropology background of me, I really like kind of having that little like lens into the different ways and different styles that people were living of different cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds during that time. But also the potential how theater and performance can like impact all of that, which I thought
Yeah,
was
yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I mean, I want a reader to be able to empathize with these folks. And I will tell you, I'd never written about the 18th century before, and I was having, in the middle of this project, sort of a really hard time seeing these people as people. And I told my wife, who's a writer and performer, I said, I can't get over the wigs. It's like, I've never written about people who wear wigs, all that these really ornate white, fancy 18th century wigs. And so to her great credit, she went out and got me an 18th century costume so that I could put it on myself and empathize a little bit. And I have to say, I think it really helped.
Also, in your book, in the photo insert, you have lots of great portraits with wigs. I have to say, there's a full array
That's
of
right.
wig portraits, all different styles. So I love that part too, because I know what you mean. The hairstyles or something.
That's right.
Now, this is like hypothetical, but I think this is kind of something interesting because obviously, even if you're not a music historian, you're definitely a culture, like you're really
Yeah.
you analyze culture and history, and obviously you do have some affinity for music if you have Vitrola. So I would love to know, do you think there's ever a possibility of a modern type of Messiah, meaning some type of cultural work that really works to unify so many people and move so many people in such a way? Because I was just curious what your thoughts are about that, because Handel's Messiah now is hundreds of years old. And
Mhm.
we're still performing it in mass. There's still hundreds of performances of this a year. It crosses over, it's not just religious. There are plenty of secular groups and organizations that are also performing this because they feel moved by it. Do you feel that there's ever some type of a cultural thing that maybe of our lifetime that could have some type of similar impact?
What a great question. That's an amazing question to think about. Something began to change with Handel in that we're very accustomed to participating in music now. You go to a
Mhm.
stadium concert, for example, and everybody's singing along. And we're very accustomed to music at scale, whether it's listening with thousands of other people at a Taylor Swift concert or at scale, even if we have our earbuds in, but we know that around the world there are millions and millions of people also with their earbuds in listening to the same recording that we're listening to. All of that was new in the 18th century. And Handel is one of the earliest people who I think would have understood music at scale and the unifying quality of music when we're all participating in it, right? Not just sort of sitting back and listening to it, but really participating. And we went through this long period from late 18th century through the 19th century where we think of what we now call classical music as a thing you kind of sit back very quietly, God forbid somebody's phone should go off, and hear what's going on the stage as these people are kind of lecturing to you musically. That was not the world that Handel inhabited. In fact, if you went to operas in that period, you would have some food along, you'd be talking throughout it. Then you might shut up if a wonderful aria was being sung by a famous diva. But then it was a raucous kind of moment. And so I think the way we experience music now, popular music now, is much closer to what Handel was creating than that long valley of orchestral 19th century music. And that's the other thing that I think I wanted to communicate to folks is that, the Baroque, as we call this particular period, the Baroque was rules breaking and weird and punk and grunge. It was this weird, out of control music of the early 18th century. And that's why later classical composers would look back on it and give it a name that's essentially an insult. So Baroque, is really an insult for this label. Handel didn't know he was a Baroque composer. Um, and so the musical world we inhabit probably has more potential for creating exactly the thing that you're talking about than an older version of, say, a 19th century, early 20th century version of classical music.
It's a great answer to think about, though. I think I'm always interested in things that can bring and cross divides in culture,
Yeah.
especially when it's related to arts, music, things like that. So I don't know. I think it's something that's really great and interesting to talk about, because sometimes there can also be arguments with like how we are so fragmented now. Like there's so many micro genres of music and stuff like that, that there's less of those big names that really bring everybody together.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's fantastic to think about.
Yeah.
We have a number of questions, so please feel free to bring your questions in. Let's see. We're gonna go ahead and start because I want to make sure we can get to everybody's. So we have a couple about Dublin, so we'll go ahead and talk about the first performance. So the DS King wants to know why Dublin, maybe over England, or even Handel himself was from Germany. So that would be interesting. And also, it was a much more scaled down performance, these first ones. Do you know what types of instruments were played in the first performances?
Yeah. So both great questions. So just take the second one first. So yes, Handel had this scored for very few instruments. And I can't remember the exact number of instruments, but it was not a modern orchestral size at all. This was, in the range of a dozen musical performers, and then of course a choir, which you would need for the choruses, and then a number of soloists, and most of the soloists would have been drawn from the choir. And the choirs were drawn from probably the adult male choristers of two cathedrals in Dublin. The total audience was about 600 or 700 people. So if you imagine then the scale of the instruments and musicians at the sort of relative to that, you get a sense of how small this first performance was. Why Dublin? Well, we were just talking about the ways in which Handel would understand our musical era. The other thing that Handel, in a way, may have invented is the kind of greatest hits tour, because by the late 1730s and early 1740s, he was extremely well known in London. He was court composer. He was a very public composer. He was the most important practitioner of Italian opera in London, but he was aging, his health was declining. He hadn't planned anything new at all for the 1741-42 season. But he got an invitation to go to Dublin, where he'd never been before, came through the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the representative of the British King, to put on a series of charity performances. And he agreed to do it. We don't know exactly why, but it would make sense for him to sort of say, I want to get out of London for a while and spend some time in this place where people obviously love me. They have, invited me to come over and do really my greatest hits through the late fall and spring of 42. And in his luggage, he was carrying that new piece of music that he had written to accompany the words selected by Charles Jennens, the thing we now call Messiah, and he performed it at the Easter season. That's when it was originally performed. That's what Handel intended it for. And when you think of the entirety of Messiah, it really is an Easter story. It's not a Christmas story, even though it contains the birth of Jesus, Christmas sort of nativity idea as one part of it, but the whole arc of the thing is an Easter story. So this is the perfect time to be listening to it now, because that's when Handel intended it.
Well, actually, that perfectly transitions into the next audience question from Lisa. Lisa shares that the Baldwin Wallace Bach Festival, which is one of the country's oldest, is performing Messiah this year for the first time. She had
Yay!
no idea Messiah was originally composed for Easter. So it's interesting to experience it in the springtime, because it is true, we always think about this with Christmas.
Yeah.
What really contributed to the shift?
Yeah. Well, we don't, it would be very nice to say, well, there was one performance that established it as a Christmas performance. But we can't identify when that specifically happened. And it probably happened at different times in different countries as this music sort of spread around the world. It was known internationally from really very early on. The first performance in the American colonies took place already in 1770. So it's already becoming a global phenomenon, even toward the end of the 18th century. We know that already by the 1830s or 1840s, people were more accustomed to hearing it at Christmas time than at Easter. And one of the big reasons for that, I think, is that it tended to track the emergence of Christmas as the primary Christian holiday, right? So theologically, of course, the big holiday is Easter. Right? Without Easter and the Easter story, you don't have the Christian faith. But for a whole variety of reasons, the celebration of the major Christian holiday shifts to the end of the year. And then as the 19th century progresses, right, people will be familiar with the role that Charles Dickens plays in making Christmas a much more important holiday. And so Handel kind of follows that. Messiah follows that to the end of the year. But you're absolutely right. If you listen to it at the Easter season and really pay attention to the words, pay attention to the arc of the story in a way that's being told, you can see how an audience at Easter time would have felt, oh, this is really appropriate to this time of the year.
Which is fantastic. And I guess if anyone is looking for an Easter time performance that's in the area, there will be one that you can probably check out.
It's brilliant.
Let's see. Well, this one's kind of a fun one. So we do have plenty of time. Please feel free to keep asking questions. I know that you are not at your residence right now, but do you know anything about the photograph behind you? It's capturing some attention.
Oh, it's actually a painting, and it's by a friend's mother. It's from Istanbul. It's a scene in Istanbul where I've spent a lot of time with a friend, where I happen to be staying right at the moment. To spend a lot of time. So yeah, I'm in New York right at the moment, rather than Washington.
There we go. Curious question from Tom. It appears that Handel was beloved by the British during the late 1700s. Do we have any historical information or history about how did the revolutionary Americans feel about Handel? Were we fans, or was there some like stronger feelings, especially with like his allegiance to Britain?
Yeah, that didn't really seem to bother, I think, people who were thinking musically at the time. So as I said, the first performance is in 1770. In fact, the first one is at just selections from Messiah at a tavern on Broadway, and then the earliest big performance is at Trinity Church, Wall Street, which still does a Messiah every year at Christmas time. But Handel became, I think, an international composer. He, as one of your earlier commenters mentioned, he was, of course, German by birth, or born in what would later become Germany, and then was a naturalized British subject. But I don't think there was much of a canyon that separated him from the Americans. In fact, Benjamin Franklin first heard Messiah in London at the Foundling Hospital in the 1750s. And what's interesting is that Franklin wrote to a relative of his that he had just been to hear the oratorio at the Foundling Hospital. He didn't even need to name it. It was already so famous that if you just said the oratorio of the Foundling Hospital, people knew what you were talking about.
Wow. So we have two that are kind of interrelated. So I'm going to kind of combine these. First, George has more of a comment, but I think anyone who's experienced it live will understand what he's saying. That his wife and himself attended a performance of Messiah at the Mies Hall in Capital University in Bexley, in Columbus, Ohio. It was just a few months ago, so one of the holiday performances. He says it was magnificent, moving, and happy. What an incredible human creation. The music, the choir, pretty much just the whole ensemble. But over time, it's become more participatory. And now we have even moments where like everybody always wants to stand during certain parts.
Yes, yes.
And we have the controversial, should Hallelujah technically be in the 2/3 section or at the end?
Yeah, yeah,
Based on if you're going to do the whole thing.
yeah.
What is the little bit of the history behind the audience? Do we know exactly about when they were starting to stand or not stand, or how
Well,
that kind
right.
of like spread?
That's a great question. And we know why it didn't happen. So it didn't happen for the reason that people always say, which is that the king, presumably they mean George II, stood at an early performance and everyone followed suit because the king was standing, presumably so moved by the music or the text or the combination of both. We know that didn't happen. We don't even know for sure whether George II ever attended one of the early London performances or not. He probably didn't. Um, the best candidate I came across for why that tradition of standing at the Hallelujah chorus began is that in an early performance, in the 1749 performance of the Foundling Hospital, Handel had recycled a bit of Messiah and renamed it the Foundling Hospital Anthem. It was a kind of piece of music for the dedication of the chapel at the Foundling Hospital. And if you listen to what's the performance of the Foundling Hospital Anthem, you will say to yourself, oh, that's just the Hallelujah chorus, which it is. And it came at the end of the performance rather than 2/3 of the way through. As you pointed out, it comes at the end of the second part in a full performance of Messiah rather than at the end. And so people may have stood at that point at the end of the performance. The other way in which this probably emerged is that um, it was unusual to hear sacred words sung in a secular setting, right? So to hear it at a music hall, which is where it first was performed in Dublin, or to hear it in the Foundling Hospital, although that was in the Foundling Hospital Chapel, and people would be accustomed in the Anglican liturgy to standing at the choruses. And so it may have been some kind of confusion for folks, are we listening to a sung liturgy, a kind of sung mass, or are we listening to a piece of music that we're just supposed to sit back and take in? But for whatever reason it first emerged, it is now, of course, customary for people to stand at the Hallelujah chorus. And I think it's a wonderful tradition because, everybody rises to their feet at this incredibly recognizable, powerful segment of Messiah.
Absolutely. I think this is a really interesting question. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are about this. Laura would like to know, she's always wondered about the process writers go through when they have the challenge of using words to describe music. Can you talk about that yourself as a writer?
Mhm.
How do you describe music?
That is great. That is a great, great question. I mean, I'm an amateur musician. I play at a few things and I love music. And, I've loved Baroque music since I was in high school band and, brass choir and that kind of thing from school days. Um, what I want to try to do, I think, I knew from the very beginning what I did, the kind of book I didn't want to write. I'm not a musicologist. I'm not particularly concerned with whether a thing was, in B flat or F sharp or, and most of my readers, so my readers anyway, would not be concerned with that. There is a professional group of musicologists who do that brilliantly, and I'm not qualified to do it. What I wanted to try to communicate was some sense of the experience of the music. So, everybody, the feeling of music is very often a very private thing. I can't describe how you feel when you're listening to a particular piece of music, but I can try to get at what the experience of it is like, Um, what are the kinds of sounds that are coming at you? Or is it quick or is it slow? Are you getting a lot of notes that are hitting you at the same time, or is it slow and ponderous? And that is so true. So what's happening in the music, right? Are there instrumentalists playing at the same time as a singer, or do the instrumentalists stop and then the singer comes in? So what I tried to do throughout the book was really to describe the music in that way. So you will know what it's like kind of to be there without insisting that you feel a particular way about it.
Okay. So absolutely, I think that's a really great way to think about it because music in our interpretation of it is a very personal thing.
Yeah,
Some people can just be moved to tears in a song, and other people could be like, I have no idea what's
yeah,
moving you
yeah,
here.
yeah, that's
Um,
right.
Absolutely, it's so personal based on our own lives and our own experiences. Haley has one last question, and then I'll have one last question for you. She really enjoyed this book, finished it right before seeing it performed by Apollo's Fire, which is
Oh, fabulous. Yes, fabulous.
um, she wants to know, you do touch on a lot of different things about life, culture, society, and the times, again, all these valleys. Was there anything you learned that you wish could have made it in the book but didn't?
That's a great question. I tend to try to put the stuff in that I think is important, I guess. And so
Mm.
if there were something that was really important, I don't think I would leave it out, at least in sort of trying to mention it. I will say it's always the case that um, I will sort of nerd out on some topic that I'm super interested in, and that at some point my editor, who is absolutely terrific, will sort of say, I think we've spent probably enough time on that. Um, and so I would get really into troop movements during the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 to 46, and I had visited the battlefield at Culloden, which some of the participants tonight may have visited in Scotland, and I could have spent pages and pages and pages on Scotland and the Jacobites and how where troops were on the battlefield at Culloden, but I tried to pull that back a little bit because I thought it probably made the point. I will say for any of you who are Outlander fans, that whole Jacobite rebellion is, of course, the thing that series Outlander kind of revolves around. And what's very interesting, now you got me started on the Jacobite rebellion. Um, what's very interesting is that at that battlefield, they were allowing the battlefield just outside of Inverness to go back to what it was like in the spring of 1746 when the Battle of Culloden took place. So it used to be sort of mowed and manicured, it wasn't what it was like in the 1740s at all. It was marshy and trees popping up and, tufts of grass over here and grazing cattle over there. And so you get right now, much more of a feel of what the 1740s in Scotland would have felt like to, kilted clansmen on one side and redcoats on the other.
Wow. So will your next book be all about war and battle strategy, or are you going to be working on something else that you'd like to share?
Well, I really don't share what I'm doing right at the moment, but I am working on a new thing. It'll probably also be an 18th century book. What I love are topics that have sort of big idea at the core, a big idea at the core that I can explore through the lives of real people. Because at the end of the day, I think historians are in the business of creating empathy, with people we can never meet because they happen to be dead. But it'll probably be something on the 18th century again.
Awesome. So everyone needs to find you online so that they can keep track of you when your next book comes out. And in the meantime, if you haven't yet, you really should grab a copy of Every Valley. I read this book. It's absolutely fascinating. Again, you don't need to be a music expert about it. And I appreciate that you didn't write about F flat or B minor or whatever like that, because this is more interesting about the people and the lives and what was going on at the time. And I think that is really what makes this all a bigger piece. And I think that's great. And I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Really a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us as well and for such thoughtful and interesting questions tonight. And we hope we can see you at a future program. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Bye.